Good afternoon, everyone. We've made it to session 4. I'm so excited to be part of session 4, workshop number 11. I am here this afternoon with Carla, Espana, and Luz Herrera, and they are here today to talk to us a little bit, and a lot. I've got a little preview, and I'm so excited to hear their whole workshop of decolonizing bilingual curriculum and pedagogy. So they're going to be sharing with us some of their ideas in a minute, but I want to take a second to introduce them. Carla was born in Chile, and she loves to teach, tell stories, write, and read young adult books and sing. She's a bilingual education clinical lecturer at Hunter College, City University of New York. She has taught educational foundations, multicultural education, bilingual literacy, and student teaching seminar courses. Her research studies the way bilingual students make meaning of their schooling, focusing on issues of translinguating and culturally sustaining pedagogy in middle school reading and writing workshop classrooms. Luz received her PhD from the Graduate Center City of University of New York. She has 7 years experience teaching emergent bilingual children in New York City public schools. She's taught undergraduate and graduate courses in bilingualism and education, race and schooling, and K-12 language and literacy. Her teaching and research are in linguistically and culturally sustaining approaches to teaching emergent bilingual learners, engaging in translinguating and critical pedagogy in classroom and bilingual education policy. We hope you stay involved today in the conversation. We'd love you to join Twitter. You can do that by using hashtag #EdCollabGathering, hashtag 11, because this is workshop 11. So I'm going to sign off and hand it over so I can learn more about many of the words I probably just didn't pronounce correctly. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be with you all today. I have learned so much from our morning opening with Chris Lehman and Dr. Debbie, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of this community today, and we're all learning together. I come to you from Queens, New York, and hopefully you don't get the noise of our lovely city. I try to keep my windows down now, so I might be sweaty and hot because I'm nervous as well, but super excited to join you, and just wanted to remind you as I try all the lovely tech that I've been learning with Claire and patience with Luz as we are learning how to screen share. Just wanted to remind you about our hashtag, so the EdCollabGathering and space hashtag 11, and you can follow Luz and I. My handle on Twitter is bilingualed_CE, and Luz is @DRA, that stands for Doctora, _Luz Yadira, and we're super excited to be with you today. So I'm going to leave you with Luz so she can introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California, and thank you, Claire, for that introduction, and I'm very excited to join you all today. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to go over, just really quickly, the workshop overview. We're going to be introducing our bilingual journeys. Carla will talk to you about her experiences shaping her work, and then I will discuss my own as well. We will then define our approach. What is decolonizing bilingual education, curriculum, pedagogy, and why it matters? And then we'll share some of our research. Carla will share hers, and I will share mine. And we will also share some recommendations that will hopefully be useful for all of you watching today, and you can share with your own colleagues. And then we'll also be tweeting these resources and recommendations throughout the day. So make sure you do follow us and look out for our hashtags as well. Thank you.
I wanted to start a little bit of discussing my journey, and I'm going to share with you some of my favorite pictures that'll kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from, not only geographically, but also with my linguistic practices. And so here's a little bit of from my childhood. So this is a picture of my mom and I when we were leaving Santiago, Chile to come to the States. And this was back in when I was about 5 years old. The middle picture is of my dad and I. He was taking me to school on Saturday. You see, so during the week, my experiences were in an English-only setting here in Queens, New York, in a school. And then on Saturdays, I went to the school on Saturdays. And it was this Argentinian school in Queens that ran every Saturday, and it was all in Spanish. And I would learn Argentinian history and songs. And I felt really good about myself on weekends. I felt really great about myself going home and talking to my parents and telling them about my school day. I didn't quite feel so well on during the week when I was in school and felt I was always behind everyone else. And I didn't feel like my identities were honored most of the time. And so moving forward later on, I really wanted to take these issues up and become a teacher for the kind of students that also went through these similar experiences I did. And thankfully, the school called Don Pedro Abisu Campos School in Upper Manhattan really opened their doors to me, and they just helped me become this really more of an aware teacher. And I still remember my moments with my 6th and 7th graders there and with the staff that I learned so much with them. And I continued with these questions about, like, what does it mean to teach bilingual students? And I went to Hunter College, and through the Teaching Fellows program was able to continue learning more, and took more of my passion and fire to the Reading and Writing Project. And what was beautiful about that experience was that I even got to work in very different settings, like all K-12 settings. And with the Graduate Center, I got to take all these questions about, like, who am I, and how can schools change to better teach students like me, because I didn't see that there were any problems with this bilingual students I taught. It's just that I had to figure out better ways to include them, their knowledge bases, and also their language practices in my teaching. So thankfully at the Graduate Center, I was able to do that kind of work. And it's also where I met Luz. And so I'm really thankful because at the Graduate Center, we both had these questions, and we said, we really want to study this. And so I'm really thankful that I've had these different organizations and institutions support me in my journey. And I'm going to pass it on to Luz, because Luz now is going to share a little bit about her own journey with language practices and schools as well.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you for sharing. When I think about my own journey, this slide really sort of encompasses my experience and the formation of everything that I do now. I grew up in California, and every year my parents, we would take an annual trip to Mexico. It took us 2 days to get there. And I was born in Mexico, and I moved to California with my parents when I was 7 years old. And every year we would go back and forth. And it was something that my parents did that really kept us connected to our language, to our culture. And that's something that I always took pride in. And I hope that I instill that in my own son today. He's been to Mexico several times. And hopefully in the future, he will go to his father's home country in Nigeria, and, continue this sort of legacy of bilingualism, biculturalism. And we're also bicoastal. I was in New York for many years. I just moved back to California to join Fresno State. But for 7 years, I taught in New York City public schools, as Claire mentioned in the introduction. And those 7 years, I was actually an ESL teacher. And I think those experiences working with the diverse communities in Harlem, that sort of led me to think about, well, this approach, this is a sort of English only, largely an English immersion approach. And I said, there has to be a better way. And that's how I got to thinking about bilingual education and wanting to become an advocate for bilingual education, because that is a more effective way to educate emerging bilingual students. And this is, so here I am. I'm now a professor of bilingual education. My research is on bilingual education. And I'm just really happy to share this journey with you all and our work moving forward. So let's think about this. So our workshop is titled Decolonizing Bilingual Curriculum and Pedagogy, and we want to tell you what this approach means or what it's all about. And there are 4 components that that help us sort of define our approach. Our approach, we center the experiences of bilingual students. It validates the humanity of all students and sustains our hybrid identity, language, practices, and culture. And finally, it includes an analysis of linguistic practices, literacies, and power. All of these things are important in thinking about how do we reframe education, bilingual education, and really make sure that it sort of centers around emergent bilingual students.
And then I want to also kind of share with you why all this matters. We're talking about human beings, we're talking about our children, and I feel that like our morning keynote and the opening words by Chris Lehman really set this up for us really well. This matters because we're concerned about rigid implementation of mandated curricula as being a subtractive experience for emerging bilinguals. Both Luz and I, in our research, we've been highly influenced by Angela Valenzuela's subtractive schooling research, and key text for us in thinking about the experiences of our students. And so instead, we want to advocate to look at students' language practices as being on a bilingual continuum. And for us, what that really means is that we really want to really change this narrative where you hear lines such as, oh, those students, I teach former L's, or those students have acquired English. And we're highly concerned about that because given the research we've done in our experiences as teachers and also as bilingual beings, we see our bilingual being in our practices as being on this continuum where there's a lot of flows as to where we are, and we don't see it as you can fully ever acquire any language. And so you'll hear a lot of, in our work and in our workshops or in our writing, we'll use terms such as students are using features of Spanish, they're using features of Spanish and English, or we say things like students have a linguistic repertoire, right? So students are pulling from the way they know how to write, how to read, how to communicate in different ways, and we do not want to use the language as saying they are former anything or that they fully acquired anything. As we're well aware of these boundaries that are placed on language by politics or these national boundaries, and we're going to talk a little bit about those influences on us and how we've been able to talk about this with students and teachers. And so for us, it's really important that we really view students in a different way. So changing our schooling practices, changing our mindset on that, on what that really means. And so I also want to show you a little bit about the findings that I had with my research. And so I'm going to just share with you what that looks like and kind of what I wanted to study. And so for me, when I was teaching 6th and 7th grade, and then I became a consultant and I was going through so many different schools, I really was fascinated by this, by so many teachers who I've been listening to so many of you today, which has been super inspiring. But I was fascinated by this one particular teacher and how this teacher taught a group of bilingual students in a setting that on paper said they could only use one language, and yet the teacher decided to bring in text and to translate and to have students go through the writing process in a more flexible, fluid way. And so these are some of the things that I wanted to find out. And so I'm just going to share that list with you. So I titled my study Escribiendo para desahogarme, which translates in to writing for release. And so it means, it's a line that just kept coming up in all the interviews I had with students. And I also put in the title Release and Resistance in a Middle School Bilingual Writing Workshop. And so I was looking at the influences on the teacher's personal narrative unit planning. I was really fascinated by how a teacher planned her lessons, but also like what were the influences on a teacher's plans, and also what were the methods that were used to teach bilingual students. And then in turn, I really, really wanted to get to know the students themselves. So I love that in my study, that I studied this middle school writing workshop, I got to talk to the teacher, I got to ask her questions about her planning process, and I got to just really learn from students and hear from students. And it's really changed my life. All of you who are in classrooms and who are administrators, teachers know how beautiful it is to just sit and ask questions of students and just really listen to them. And I'm really excited because after Luz also goes through a little bit about her, a little overview about her research, we're both going to share with you our findings and what we found in our research, as well as what we recommend to you in teaching bilingual students.
Yes, so my research, it was done in a bilingual middle school classroom in New York City. And how I came to work with that school is that I was part of CUNY NYSEB. That's the CUNY, and NYSEB stands for New York State Initiative on Emerging Bilinguals. We received a grant from the state to work with schools all across New York State to help, help prepare schools, start some bilingual programs, offer professional development to the staff, faculty, and so this is one of the schools that I worked with, and I really wanted to do a research project in this school because I thought the teacher was excellent. I thought the principal was amazing and was really supportive of bilingual education and translanguaging, which I will talk about in a little bit. But so my work is titled Translanguaging Practices for Educational Equity, and I am sharing the screen in just a second. All right, there it is. So it's titled Translanguaging Practices for Educational Equity, Moments in a Bilingual School Classroom. And I'll also tweet out the link to where you can find the entire research project. So if you want to, you can take a closer look at it. But there are three components to this work. Well, first, it was the social justice curriculum that I designed and implemented in this middle school classroom. The curriculum made use of multimodal text, and we'll tell you about what that looks like in a little bit. And it also centered the use of translanguaging pedagogy. And what does that mean, translanguaging? Of course, this work is influenced by Ofelia Garcia. Carla and I are actually both mentees of Ofelia Garcia. We're very fortunate to have someone like her guide us through our work, and just overall an amazing experience to be able to work with her. It's such an honor. She's retiring next spring, and we're just so sad that, not a whole lot of future students will get to enjoy her brilliance. But so translanguaging pedagogy is really about allowing students, or in the classroom, I don't like this word allow, but making spaces in the classroom for students to be able to draw from their entire linguistic repertoire. Often we hear this word like code switching and what that means, but translanguaging is not code switching. Translanguaging is simply, we have this entire linguistic repertoire that we as bilinguals sort of negotiate depending on our context, our surroundings to utilize, and we use those resources that in order to help us learn best. And we do that in every setting, and the classroom is an important space to be able to use that as well. So again, this centered, translanguaging was the center of my project, and on our approach, translanguaging is also an extremely important component, and we're happy to be able to share and continue to share Ofelia's work and her influence on our work as well. Carla's going to go over the recommendations as well.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you started talking about translanguaging, because I see that question came up on Twitter. And so I'll give some more examples on that, on how I've used that in my own teaching. But these are some of the 5 recommendations that, I'm sorry, let me put this so you can see a little bigger. Some of the recommendations that we're going to go through, and with our remaining time, And so the first one is that we believe that instead of going straight ahead into planning curriculum, we really, really want to start with reflecting on our own ideologies. So what are our belief systems? What are our beliefs about students' language practices? Right, so if students switch one language to another, or they're using features from one language or the other, how do we feel about that? What's our reaction? You know, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to discuss the use of students' full linguistic and cultural repertoires, the importance of sharing your own linguistic practices. Maybe that means sharing your own writing. So I'll show an example of that. Considering different teaching methods. I love how that's been a thread in a lot of the sessions I've been listening and watching today. And also, as Luz said, thinking about multimodal texts and the way she used it in her research. And so I'd love to just show you kind of 2 or 3 different examples of those recommendations, and then Luz will also go through some of them. So the first one comes from the teacher that I studied. And so I spent time in this classroom that was a 6th grade bilingual classroom, and the teacher made sure that her teaching reflected the reality of her students' lives. And so here are some examples of that. And so I'm going to just put the slide there because I think it's important for you to be able to see it as well. Oh, but before that, wait, I went ahead of myself. Yes, okay, because I'm gonna go back on my own words, I have to, the first thing we said, we wanna make sure we reflect on our own practices, right? Okay, so before I even show you what the teacher did, first, I wanna go through what is it that we can do as educators to reflect on our own practices before we get into the kind of classroom lessons. And so the following is an activity that I've done with teachers and teacher study groups. I've done it around the country, and I've just loved the schools that have welcomed this kind of approach, and they've created a safe space for teachers to engage this topic of language and linguistic practices and power. And so, as Luz described earlier, central to our approach is really making sure that we do not discuss this without considering the issue of power that lies whenever we talk about linguistic practices, and which are the languages that are validated, which are the ones that are not. I have one of my own students at Hunter College. She is in her last year in her student teaching time. So she's going into full-time teaching next year. And I asked her how her research seminar was. And I'm always fascinated by it to see what our future teachers are questioning, and I love hearing their research questions. And she said that she really wants to study why is it that certain bilingual dual language programs in New York City specifically, because that's where we are. She said, how come certain ones are the ones that are in the New York Times and the ones that get highlighted and others are not? And I said, well, unpack that for me. What do you mean? Which ones are highlighted and celebrated? And she said, oh, well, it's usually the ones that have students that are, the ones that are with students that are of color. Those are the ones that usually being pushed out, or that people are not celebrating. But the ones where it's mostly white middle class students learning another language besides English and getting taught in those languages, those get celebrated. She's just like, why is that? And what are the parents doing in one case, and what's the city doing? And she found out that our chancellor had sent a press release out like last spring about all these bilingual dual language programs opening in the city. And so I'm excited because this student teacher of mine is investigating these issues. And so she's doing that in a course that's helping her do this across a whole semester. So how do you do it in your school? Might be through a teacher study group. It might be through on your own journey. And so I'm just going to share with you one example of something you might do. And so this is one activity that I've done with teachers and reflecting on our own language ideologies. I create a text set. I love creating text sets, and I wish I could show you my desk, which I might in a little bit. It's just I have tons of text sets on poetry and different books. This one is on language ideologies, right? So it's on issues of language and power. And we move through an analysis of Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue. We then go through Tongue Tactics by Maida del Valle, We go through Jamila Scott's TED Talk, 3 Ways to Speak English, her poem, and we finalize with an excerpt from The Skin We Speak. And this chapter is called No Kind of Sense by Lisa Delpit. And so what do I do through that? And so through that, what I've loved doing is that, first of all, if you haven't read Borderlands, La Frontera by Gloria Saldúa, just please get it as soon as possible. And when you do read it, can you just find me on Twitter? Just please, let's talk about this, because I read this book every single year. It just gives me life, and it keeps affirming my identities. And I'm so glad it was assigned to me in grad school back in the day in a class called Myth, Utopia, and Faith, because I found it on the inside cover. That's where my class was. And what I love about this activity is that teachers will go through these texts. I've also done this with middle school students in different schools. And we really talk about who gets to speak in what way and what are the authorities and that are dictating the way people speak. So I'm really excited to be a part of groups where we get to unpack those language ideologies. And then Luz will go through another type of way that you can join in your study group or with students to also talk about these issues.
Yes, thank you, Carla, for sharing those. At least 3 of those resources that you just shared, I just shared recently in my classroom and with my teachers, with my future teachers at Fresno State. And actually, every year I start out also with this video that I'm about to I'm going to give you a screenshot of. Give me 1 second. But it's a short film called Immersion from Media That Matters. And, you know, this is one of those short films that really has made a great impact on the teacher that I've taught, I've had over the years. And this film is about a boy named Moises. He is a newcomer. A newcomer from Mexico. And one of the first days of school for him, he has to take this math exam. And Moises is very bright. He knows the math content, but because he is a newcomer, even though he knows the math content, it doesn't matter because he just doesn't know how to answer the questions, the math word problems, because he can't read them. And so this video just sort of takes us through, well, what did the teacher do? What did the principal do? What the classmates did around Moises? And then, when we think about our language ideologies, I sort of turn it over to my students, and I ask them, well, what would you do? What should the teacher have done? What could have the principal have done? What are some ways that we could have supported Moises? And actually, I showed this film also to my middle school students during my research project, and they got to share their own ideas. And I was just so amazed by the kinds of ways that they came up with as to how the teacher could have helped Moises. One of the things that they mentioned was, well, why couldn't he have the exam in Spanish? Why couldn't he have made use of the glossary? Why did the teacher have to take away the glossary during the exam? All of these things, our students, our middle school students are even able to identify these ways that we could have helped Moises, but all of those things sort of, matter. And all of these ideologies that we have matter in the classroom. And that's why really these exercises are important to think about and to go through as we are sort of in the classroom. And maybe we can even use these with our own students because they have their own ideas and thoughts on language and how to broker language in the classroom.
So I love that you talked about that immersion film. I just got a flashback to when I was watching it with teachers in Seattle, and we also had this conversation about what are the options that we have in the classroom, and how do we value the humanity of all children to make sure that the experiences that they have are liberating, transformative experiences in the classroom. I also wanted to talk about that other picture that's on there, and it's from a series of really short video clips. It says chapters, and they're really, really short. They're like around 5 minutes, some of them. And so Miguel is an artist, and he goes on this beautiful journey to Mexico with his father and brother, and he hadn't been there, and he goes to see to visit family and really reconnect with connect with the other roots that he hadn't connected with. And for me, it's been beautiful to analyze that and really watch it with the ideas of these issues of like the centrality, like how central language practices are to our being, how the intimacy with our family and the experiences we have with music and with the land. Like there are different scenes where he's either talking about family gatherings, or when he's talking about corn and maize. And I just feel like it's such a beautiful text to really contextualize this work that we're talking about in terms of language practices. And so those are just some ideas, right? And some activities that some texts that we use to talk about issues of language and power, and really to help us reflect. And so I really wanted to also show you then some of the examples from classrooms and from the one that I study. And here we go. This is what I was trying to get to earlier, and I had gotten ahead of myself. So this is from the teacher that I studied in 6th grade bilingual classroom. And this is one way, right, that she was honoring students' full linguistic and cultural repertoires. She read The Lead to Each Kindness, another beautiful text by Jacqueline Woodson. And right, she read, so we'll call the classroom teacher Alejandra. She read, "That winter, snow fell on everything, turning the world a brilliant white." And immediately a student followed up with a translation in Spanish. That is how the students communicate. That is the space the teacher's creating in the classroom to honor those practices. The teacher also shared her own writing. And so you see how she does this. She says, "So now you're going to try this lead, which is starting with the setting. Listen to me as I show you how to do it. I can say," and then she proceeds to describe her lead in Spanish. "El sol entraba por la ventana. Mis ojos sentían y veían algo amarillo dentro de mis ojos. Los apreté porque sabía que era hora de levantarme." So what she did there was she was trying out her strategy in Spanish, set it up in English. And what's really beautiful is that she is allowing the students to also participate in ways that also honor the way they live. And so we could call that as one example of translanguaging, right? So the teacher could be speaking in English and the kids could be taking notes in Spanish. That's an example. Or they could read a text. Sometimes texts have translanguaging within them. So you'll see texts that have either one page is in English, the other is in Spanish, or even within. So a lot of our texts from that I've seen, and I'll be sharing this resource with Luz on Twitter after our chat. There's a whole guide to use of translanguaging in Latino literature, for example, that CUNY and ICEB also worked on. So we'll be sharing that on Twitter. But that's, it's just two different examples of what a teacher does to embed translanguaging practices in the classroom. And I'll show you one more also, because I think it's important to see, well, what about during a lesson that's not an interactive read aloud, or that's not reading a text for author's craft, as we might do in a writing workshop if you're doing that method. So in this case, I'll share with you this slide. So in this case, she was doing a leads lesson, and she decided to make sure that the students got more than one opportunity to practice. And she decided to use texts that figured characters that students were connecting to. So in our approach, Luz and I make sure that we're always reminding teachers that we work with that we want to make sure that our teaching and our curriculum matches it reflects the student's reality, and it also opens them up to other opportunities. So for example, in this case, the teacher knew how the students were feeling with their experience with learning in English. She also knew that they had expressed their anxiety and fears around being a new student, and also issues of poverty. And we used, they used this text, Cajas de Cartón, which is the Circuit translation from Francisco Jimenez's first memoir, a series of 3 memoirs. And in that example, you saw how the teacher had multiple times guide that inquiry. Like, how does this author start this lead? Let's try it out together. Let's watch, let's learn, let's do it multiple times, so they have a lot of times to practice it. And Luz will show you some examples next about from her own research in using multimodal text, and what do we mean by multimodal text.
Yeah, so for my research, as I said, I designed and I implemented a curriculum. It was in a social studies class, and it was in a class that was made up of all Latinx students. And again, it was a bilingual setting. And one of the things that I thought it was important to do is design a curriculum that really connected, that could really connect with students, that was really powerful and transformative. And I centered it around immigration. We talked about the immigration debate that was going on. It was a few years ago, and it's still obviously going on today. But President Obama's executive action on immigration had just occurred, and what that did was expand DACA, and now we're seeing DACA is being threatened, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. But anyway, so we analyzed the executive action. We also talked about the tens of thousands of kids, unaccompanied minors, that were being detained at the border, coming mostly from some Central American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, fleeing for various reasons. Violence was one of them, but also just the conditions of poverty and just seeking better opportunities. So we talked about the journeys of the kids. We read first-person narratives of the kids from newspapers and other outlets. We used Twitter. We followed the hashtag executive action to see some of the reactions to President Obama's announcement, and sort of talked about, like, well, why did this person react this way? Why did that person react that way? And analyze those tweets. We we tapped into various resources. I wanted to make it as sort of interesting as possible, but also just really make use of multimodal text. And I'm going to show you some examples in a second. So, I used YouTube to find news clips in various languages. For example, like some announcements from Primer Impacto in Spanish, a short clip that sort of shows the crisis at the border and the crisis at these detention centers. We looked at images of crowded detention centers and thought about what that means. And, what was really powerful about this is that a lot of the kids were, my students' own ages, 12, 13, 14, 15, all of these kids were traveling by themselves and, being detained in these crowded centers. So we talked about some really powerful things, and they have some opinions. They had, it was just amazing, the conversations that took place, and through the use of translanguaging, the kids were able to share. They were able to contribute and feel like they have a voice, and feel like they could really not be limited by some of these sort of strict language practices that are sometimes characteristic of some bilingual programs that really sort of isolate the languages. But in this space, I really created the space for students to be able to, you can use your entire linguistic repertoire. I just want you to be able to share whatever it is that you want to share, and do that to the best of your ability, and use your, English and Spanish together, whatever it is that you, that allows you to voice yourself better. So I'm going to show you one example. So as I said, we talked about the crisis at the border and the children being detained. And so one of the response from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection was to launch a danger awareness campaign, and they distributed these posters to various countries in Central America, like Honduras and Guatemala. They also created radio PSAs as well as TV ads, and I showed them to the kids. I showed them the TV ads, and I showed them the posters, and we got to analyze these and talk about these and the intent behind these. And again, they got to use their entire linguistic repertoire. They got to not only learn some powerful content in Spanish, in English. This was mostly in Spanish, particularly because this was aimed for Honduras and Guatemala, as you can see here. but it was just a very powerful experience, and I hope that you can read some of that in my research that I'll be sharing a little bit.
Thank you, Luz. And so I wanted to end with a final recommendation, and just to expand a little bit more on that definition of translanguaging that we've been using, since it's a thread in all of Luz's examples and all of my examples. And so I wanted to show you a visual that represents that as well. And this comes from an article written by Ofelia Garcia and Camila Leiva. Camila was a New York City high school teacher, and she worked with Ofelia Garcia on this as Ofelia visited her classroom. And in Camila's classroom, Camila would use songs in English and in Spanish. The particular lesson in that article describes her teaching about conflict in literature and different types of conflict, and she taught it through those two songs, and had the students, whether she was speaking sometimes in English, they would respond in Spanish and in English, using different features of their language repertoire. And so in that article and in our work that Luz and I have described to you, we love defining translanguaging and explaining it in the following way. So we see translanguaging as linguistic practice. So it is what bilingual beings do. This is what we do. This is how we communicate. It is also pedagogy, so it's methods of teaching. So what Camila did in that classroom, or what I did last week in my class using the song Somos Sur by Ana Tijoux, and with Shadia Mansour. The song is in Spanish and in Arabic, and I did a lesson in Spanish using the Spanish and English translations. And while I was teaching in Spanish and I walked around and listened to my students discuss the themes in that song, they were discussing it using features of Spanish and English. And finally, translanguaging is a philosophy for social justice. So it means we are validating the practices of our students. We are honoring their humanity, right? We are including their ways of being in our classroom. And so in our work, using translanguaging as, let's go through them again. It's our linguistic practice, it is our pedagogy, and it is a philosophy for social justice. We advocated, and we are excited that we got to share those examples with you today. And I leave you, because I could recommend books all day, but I'll leave you with these two that are the ones that I'm reading as in right now, as in this entire semester for fall, and with my students, and I'm using a lot of these in my classes. So it's Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, and I've been on phone calls from East Coast, West Coast with Luz to discuss a lot from this book by Paris and Alim, and as well as racial linguistics. So we've been discussing issues of language and power, and making sure that our instruction and our pedagogy is culturally sustaining, using those examples that we showed you. So I just want to thank you. I know Luz has a few words, and we have about, I think, 2 minutes maybe. So go ahead, Luz. And maybe we'll take questions on Twitter. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Again, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure to be able to present some of this work with you all. And again, you know, we're standing on some shoulders of some giants. You know, Ofelia Garcia, as Carla and I mentioned already, is our mentor, and you know, such a brilliant thinker that really pushed our thinking about around this topic. And I'm glad Carla shared the Paris and Alim book. That's also an important work that has helped us shape our work, shape our own work, sorry. And again, thank you for joining us. Again, we will be sharing some resources on Twitter, and my handle, as you can see, is @DRA_Luz Yadira, and I hope to see you there. Thank you. Claire, do we have any questions?
I don't know. We'll ask Claire. Claire, any time for questions?
I don't think so. I think you'll be able to see some stuff on Twitter, but we only have a couple minutes to go on to the break for the next session, unless you have one you want to answer that you received.
Okay, so I was looking on our, just because I have TweetDeck up, so I'm just following all this on the EdCollab gathering. So at least I answered the one, and Luz also answered the one on translanguaging. and then people were sharing the resources. So I think the last thing we'll do is just remind people to go on, just make sure you're following us on Twitter. We're going to be sharing all the resources we mentioned. We have it all saved up. See, my timer went off. So we have all the resources saved with links and pictures to share with you on Twitter. And the final thing, yes, I want to make sure that people use this break time. So I want to honor that time so they can go and donate to the charity that Dr. Debbie Reese spoke up to us about. So yes, let's honor that time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. There was packed full session. I learned a lot of that was really new for me. And that, I think, most of all in reflection is concerning to me, how much was new. The amount of time I spend partnering in schools with diverse populations, but yet even all the classes I've taken, a lot of what you shared today was different. I love the word repertoire. I think for all students, it's a great way to think about learning and to think about continuums. I loved that word. And I really loved that you ended it with the philosophy of social justice, because it is about our practice in pedagogy and philosophy, but human justice and honoring all of our students and their identities and their stories and their journeys is critical to everything that we do. And it has been a major theme of today. So thank you so much. I definitely plan on relooking at this and watching it. Multimodal text, we're thinking so much around text sets and ways to bring different types of text to kids, and really thinking about this through a new lens was inspiring today. So thank you so much for sharing all your research and your experience. Up next, we do, as we mentioned, we have a quick break. And then after that, we will have our closing keynote. So I'm trying to put that up here. So at 3 p.m., come join us for Teaching Tolerance. We're going to hear from Amy and Lisa to talk about the project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we're excited to hear that. So take a break. Definitely pay it forward with your EduJoy and consider contributing to one of the charities from today. And we look forward to seeing everyone at 3 o'clock. Thanks, everyone.